Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. We had a little bit of a glitch this morning because Audrey is already on standard time, and in Canada, we don't do that until tonight. So there was a little bit of a delay there. However, we have Audrey online now, and she is ready to go. Audrey Collins is the family history record specialist at the National Archives, and she is going to be giving us an overview of what she's going to be discussing in her week-long course at the British Institute in October 2019, where she will be talking more in depth about the resources at the National Archives. Welcome, Audrey.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. And I'm not at all flustered or panicky. It's all fine. Everything's going to go smoothly.
Of course it is. Of course it is. Just to let everybody know, I will
Yeah.
send out the handout after the webinar is
Mm.
finished. And then if they have any follow-up questions, they can certainly email them to me and I can get those to you. But in the
Oh,
meantime, we
absolutely.
are going to sit back and listen and watch. And anybody has questions, they can go ahead and type those in the chat box. So I will now hand it all over to you. Thanks, Audrey.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I'm really looking forward to doing this course. And the handout, when you get it, I did have the foresight to format it in letter size and not A4. So if anybody wants to print it out, it's a sensible size. But it's much better as an online handout because I put lots of links in it, mainly to bits of the website that are going to be useful for you. Now, I planned this out, and it's really helped me with planning the course that I'm teaching. Because there's nothing quite like having to do a presentation to make you crystallize your ideas. And I've put it into 10 sections which will follow the classroom sessions that I'll be doing at the British Institute. Although it might change as I develop the course content in more detail. I might change things because they do take on a life of their own. And although I hope everybody will book to come to the course. I'm a realist. I know not everybody will be able to do that. So for anybody who's listening, who's not going to be able to come to the course, I hope there's enough content here that you will at least be able to get something out of it, although you don't get the pleasure of my company as a drinking companion for a week. So what I wanted to start with is just outline some of the aim of the course. It's about using the National Archives, but not just about using the records of the National Archives. It's using a lot of the resources that we have as well, because you can do a lot more than just find our records and use them. There is a lot of interaction with other records that are held elsewhere. And the other thing I really want to do, the more I teach, the more important I find this is to help you understand the how and the why. If you know how a record was created and why it was created and by whom and under what circumstances, the more I research, the more I become convinced that that was really helpful towards understanding the records and their strengths and their limitations and how you can best use them, and also how to get round the problems that you encounter for records that are missing or records that were never kept in the first place. So I really want this to be almost as much about skills and enabling people to find things for themselves, as well as telling them about some of the fantastically useful and important record collections that we do have here. Now, what I want to start with is, first of all, saying who are we? The National Archives, famously, it's one of two major national archives in the world that just calls itself the National Archives. It doesn't have in its title the National Archives of. When pushed, we describe ourselves as the National Archives of the United Kingdom. But even that's not a simple answer, because the United Kingdom is a very different thing depending on the date you're talking about. There was no such thing as the United Kingdom until 1707, which is the first Act of Union with Scotland. And in 1801, the second Act of Union with Ireland. So although Ireland had been under the control of the by then British monarchy for a long time before that, it formally became part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And then, of course, just about a century ago, part of Ireland gained independence. So what is currently the United Kingdom is England, Wales, Scotland, and part of Ireland. And then there are some other places which are small, but I hate to leave them out, and that's the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, which are not part of the UK, although for convenience they're often classified that way. They are actually protectorates under the Crown. So they have their own legal systems and they have their own taxation and their own postage stamps. But they do come under United Kingdom for some functions and not for others. It's a very complicated little group of islands. And I have to say that a lot of English people tend to use the terms England and Britain interchangeably, which is why I never blame Canadians or Americans for doing that, because they have probably learned from English people who should know better, but they don't. And in case you think I sound like a very English person, I'm not. I only live here. I am mostly Scottish, and the rest of me is Irish. So, like most other Scottish and Irish and Welsh, and of course Manx and Channel Islanders, I am very well aware of the differences between the different bits of the United Kingdom, the British Isles, England, Wales, Scotland, etc. And that's important, not just because people like me get prickly when you use the wrong term, but as a genealogist, it's really important to understand these exciting things like administrative units, because it's these political units and administrative boundaries. These are the organizations that create the records that we really want to use because they've got our ancestors in them. And it's important to know that you're looking in the right place. So that's why it's quite important to know that England and Britain are not the same and why that's important. And there are some records which are English, some which are Scottish, some which relate to the British Isles, etc., and some which are UK-wide. So I'm going to cover a lot of those things in detail further on in the course, but the first thing it really is to sort of set the scene. And I call that, and you'll see it in the handout eventually, is the National Archives of where exactly? Question mark. So that's really setting the scene. And there's a couple of things that I can show you. You've had a long enough look at our the landing page of the website. Most of what is going to be useful for genealogists is in the help with your research area. And we will be going there in a minute. But if you scroll down the web page, you find there are all sorts of other things, and it's rather hidden at the bottom. But we have an education section, which is very, very important. It's aimed at schools and teachers, but it's really very useful for all sorts of other people, anybody who's interested in history and in British history, and particularly if you weren't brought up in the UK. You probably don't have such a good grasp of the outline of English and British history, and this is a good way of finding out. Come to that, a lot of people who were brought up in England don't have a very good grasp of English and British history. So I'm just going to have a quick look into the education department, and it's divided into time periods and themes, but there's the one that I wanted to point you at, and there will be a direct link in the guide, is in the section Early Modern. They have all sorts of very cool stuff. But somewhere down near the bottom, and you can just see as I'm sort of flicking past these things, there's some quite interesting things in there. There are even games, in Great Fire of London game. But right near the bottom, I promise you it's there, I know I've seen it, there is, there it is, called Uniting the Kingdoms. This was put up online quite a long time ago, but it's still a rather good introduction to how the United Kingdom first came about. It's dealing with the early period, but it explains rather well all about the different constituent parts and how they came together. So as you could see there are lots and lots of useful things in that education area, which I strongly advise you to have a look at. When you just fancy a nice little read and look at some pictures. We are beginning to work more closely with education than we used to. And quite irrelevant to the course, but it's a handy way of finding your way around. If you're anywhere at all on the National Archives website, and it's a very big place, If you see this, the logo and the title at the top, if you click on that, that will take you right back to the home page. It's you really need a map to find your way around, and what I'm going to do is show you some of the shortcuts and some of the ways that you can find your way around, and I'll go into that a little bit more. Now, because I know people do want to know about records and not just about background and theory and skills, I am going to be covering some of the records in a fair bit of detail. And the key records for any country, for any kind of genealogy, are things like census records, vital records of births, marriages and deaths, and probate records. They are extremely useful in a lot of places. They're certainly very, very useful for English and British research. And we do have some of all of these. Now, the main birth, marriage and death records for England and Wales and elsewhere are not held at the National Archives. They are the more recent ones are going to be held at one or other of the General Register offices, either England and Wales or Scotland, or the two Irish General Register offices. And for the earlier period, church records, parish records, they're generally going to be held locally in county record offices. But we do have some very, very important collections of birth, marriage and death records. One of them is the non-conformist and non-parochial records, which we have a very large collection. The reason for this is that in 1837, civil registration had been set up and the Registrar General called in all the non-conformist records, the ones that the various organisations and sects had been creating for themselves, and these were called in so that they could be authenticated and so that they could issue certified copies when people needed these things as proof of their legitimacy, proof of relationships and so on. And those are among the very first records in the National Archives that were indexed. They were on Family Search before it was Family Search, when it was still the IGI on those slippery old microfiche, and even before that, and I have to say before I started doing genealogy, something called the precursor to the IGI, which I believe was called the Computer File Index. So they were among the very first records that were subject to massive indexing projects. And that's a very important set of records. We don't have every single one. A lot of records weren't handed in and just don't survive, and others turned up later and they've been deposited elsewhere. But it's a very, very important set of records, and it's a very large set of records. And not everybody realises they belong to the National Archives, but they do. And they're available on a number of websites. And it's something I touch on a little bit later, which is that a lot of National Archives records for family history have been digitised, and you'll find some of them on the National Archives site, but a lot of them are on other sites. And again, I will explain how and why that came about a little bit later. So we don't have the main collection of birth, marriages and deaths, but we still do have a large number of records which will be useful for at least some researchers. The other kind of records, obviously the census records is the main one. All the census records from 1841 up to 1911, and we are beginning to go down the road of releasing the 1921 census. That'll be out in January 2022, and that'll be very exciting. All of those census records, they are all held at the National Archives. There's only one tiny little exception, and that is a book which was believed to be missing. And it turned up in the secondhand bookshop, and it's for part of Wrexham. So the original is now safely deposited in the Denbighshire Record Office, but that is the only bit of original census enumeration books that we don't have. And I'm fine with that because we've got a transcribed copy. So census records are extremely important, and one of the things that I will do is to look at the way the census appears on the various commercial sites and how you can use those and some other indexes that aren't accompanied by images to get the best out of the census records. There is a big advantage in a record being on several different sites. First of all, it means if you only subscribe to one site, you've probably got a shot at census records. But if you have access, either through your own subscription or through a library or an archive. If you've got access to multiple sites, it can be very, very useful to use more than one site. Not partly because the transcriptions may be different, but also the search engines and the way the records are presented can be different. That could apply to any set of records, but it's particularly useful for the census because it's so widely available. And there are quite a lot of hints and tips about using the various different sites, and also about the proper way to quote a census reference, which I really wish everybody would know, because knowing how your friend found it on Ancestry isn't always very helpful if you are trying to find the same thing on your subscription to Find My Past or My Heritage, and it doesn't seem to be working. Another really useful set is the third arm really is wills and probate records. And these are split between a number of different archives and repositories, of which we have got one of the main collections. The short version of probate research is that in 1858, in England and Wales, there was a completely new central probate registry was set up. And after that, it's one fairly simple, straightforward system. And we don't have those records. They are with the court service and they can be searched online. So we refer people to them, but we don't hold them. Before 1858, you have a sort of patchwork quilt of probate jurisdictions throughout England and Wales. And these follow the hierarchy of the Church of England. We have the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, which is a terrible mouthful, which is why we abbreviate it to PCC. And those records are held here at the National Archives, and they were among the very first records that we digitized at around about the time when the 1901 census was getting all the headlines and not actually working terribly well for a while. It's fine now. Quietly, the National Archives, or the Public Record Office as it was called at that point, were uploading a decade at a time the wills, the registered copy wills in the PCC, and they go back to 1383 or 1385, thereabouts, and they go right up to the first few days of 1858. And these were going online a decade at a time, very, very quietly, but in its way, I think was just as important and significant a step as the big fanfare that greeted the 1901 census. And these are very, very useful, partly because you can find the wills of named ancestors. But one of the things that struck me at the time is that probate records are an incredibly useful way of making that elusive connection across the Atlantic. If you can find a document on one side of the Atlantic that names a relative and identifies them on the other side of the Atlantic, that can be this precious link that you're looking for, to find your earliest colonial ancestor. And although you can only search them by the name of the person who left the will, once you've looked at it, you can instantly download these things and you can look at them and you can find the names of the beneficiaries. I thought this was quietly revolutionary in its way. And it still is a very, very useful tool for finding, just establishing relationships, whether it's across the Atlantic or just unraveling several families with common names in the same area. So those are incredibly useful. We have, as I said, the Archbishop of Canterbury's wills, which on the whole is where the top people were. So you definitely get the great and good there. You get royalty and you get the nobility and rich people. But we don't, that doesn't mean we don't have wills of labourers. You can search these wills online and you can search by place and occupation. And if you put in labourer as an occupation, you'll still get a fair few results. So it's always worth looking there. And one of the things I do in this session is, I said earlier that this link, Help With Your Research, is the place to go. That's where all the cool stuff is. And if you click on that, it takes you to a page where you have links to lots and lots of research guides. And in the handout, I've singled out 3 of them, the ones that relate to census and wills, and also to death duties, which are related to probate records. This was the Inland Revenue getting its tax. So these are going to be fairly reliable records, and they are very useful. They cover roughly, they cover the 19th century. They're particularly useful for the first half of the century because they form what's the nearest thing to a national probate index. But you'll see from the page here that this Find a Research Guide, we've got lots of different categories, and a lot of guides appear in more than one category. For example, if you were looking for a First World War soldier, you would find record guides under family history. You'd find them under First World War, and you'd also find them under military and maritime. We try to cater for the sort of lines of thought and research paths that different people will be taking at different times. If you go into the family history section here, you'll find we have an awful lot of guides. Currently, it's 195. It varies a bit. Sometimes there are more and sometimes there were fewer because we write new guides and we amalgamate old ones, but it's give or take 200 or just below. And at the top of the list, you can see we headline some of the most popular guides. One of them is the Guide on Census Records, which has fairly recently been expanded and updated. There's a lot more information in it than there used to be. And although that won't take you to the census itself, it takes you to a lot of useful background, for example, definitions of common abbreviations that you find in the census, and also links to useful resources to where you can find the census online, and also to some finding aids and a few other things that will help you. The wills 1384, that is just about those PCC wills, but we also have another guide, and I just scroll down the page, you can just see how long this list is. You don't always have to have this big list. You can actually filter this list using the menu on the left. But I just this once, I just want to show you how big it is. So we have nearly 200 guides there, so there must be at least one that you'd like. But if you go all the way down, almost to the bottom, if I'm giving anybody vertigo, I do apologise. We have records about wills or administrations before 1858. And I'm just going to click on that one just to show you what the guides looks like. And that it follows the pattern that a lot of our guides do. And it explains about the principles of probate research, and it does tell you about the records that we hold, 1384, I was close, 1384 to 1858, but it also tells you about other resources, the records that you can find here at the National Archives, and also records that you can find elsewhere. And you can see there are a lot of other resources there. Most of the guides follow a similar pattern. If I go back up to the top of the guide, you'll see that you have this little link that says how many are online, and that appears on, I think, virtually all of our guides. It's a handy, quick reference because we know the first thing people want to know is what have you got, or have you got records on this subject, and the next thing they want to know is what's online. So we give an indication. In an awful lot of cases, it will be some. In a very few, very specific guides, it will be all records. And in some cases, bad news, there are no records online. But even where records aren't online, there are still ways of getting at them. So that really covers those main areas. We will have another guide about birth, marriage and death records in the British Isles. That's a new guide. It's an amalgamation of a couple of other guides, and it's been greatly expanded, and I haven't finished it yet, but it will probably be online within the next month or two after the editors have been over it and checked for all my mistakes. So that was the first 2 sessions. The third one would be an in-depth look at the website and its resources. And this will go into, look at a lot of these guides and how they can be used and the sort of resources that they can take you to. I've just realised I made a typo in the handout. There is no prize for you spotting it, but it's there anyway. Um, and if you go back to the page where we were before, we've got all the list of the family history research guides, but then back to the Find a Research Guide page. At the top of the page, you see all these links to the guides, and that's really the place where you should always start, particularly if it's a record set that you're not familiar with. But if you scroll down a bit further, there are all sorts of other things. If you're lucky enough to be able to come and visit us, we're a nice place to visit. We've got a lake with water birds outside and swans. And if you're from Canada, if you could take back with you at least one of the Canada geese, that would be really nice. But they're okay, I suppose. At least they don't pick off the young of other species like the heron does. This is how, all the details, if you're going to visit us in person. And if you can't, then it explains how you can pay for someone else to do your research. We have our own in-house paid search service, and we also have a lot of independent researchers. And in most cases, getting an independent researcher is probably a better bet. It can be cheaper and more efficient, but it depends on what you want. We do have the option of using our own paid search service, so the choice is yours and the details are there. It also tells you how you can obtain copies of documents, and because if you identify a document and it's not something that's online, and the great majority of records aren't, unfortunately, and they probably never will be, if you can identify a document or a part of a document, you can order copies directly from our record copying department, and the copies can be produced on paper, or nowadays far more people want to have a digital copy, and then that saves an awful lot of postage and handling, and then you can do what you like with the image, which would of course be in color, and then you can print it out, keep it, manipulate it, do what you like with it. So that was a very welcome development when we were able to do that. And you also see it on the right hand side, we do have a live chat service during the hours that we're open, which is 9 till 5 our time, Tuesdays to Saturdays, and that's actually what I was doing until I came over here to do the webinar. And you can email us with slightly more complicated queries. We can't go into a lot of depth to help you with your research, because there's a lot of you and there's not many of us, but what we can usually point you in the right direction, and that's also what we aim to do. If you're here in person or on the telephone, we can guide you to the next stage of research, and you can come back as often as you like. It's just that we can't sit down and do long research projects with you, even if we find they're really interesting, which we often do. Below that, there are links to other resources. In particular, we've got the other research tools. There are things like the Manorial Documents Register. We don't hold manorial documents on the whole. We have very few. Most of them are held in other places, and they're often very unpredictable places. So the Manorial Documents Register, which is gradually being digitized, not the actual records, but the indexes and catalogues that show you where records are. That is gradually being added to, so you can find out where manorial records are. And we have a couple of other things in there, and our library catalogue. Our library on site is an extremely good reference library. Unfortunately, it's only a reference library, and we don't do lending, and we don't do interlibrary loans, so we don't have some of the services that other libraries do. But it's still very useful all the same. And again, if you are fortunate enough to be able to visit, do not neglect the library. I make myself quite popular with the librarians by always plugging their resources, because they can help you an awful lot. Again, one of the sessions further on is talking about printed sources, which might be in our library, but you might equally be able to find them somewhere else, and they can also be very, very useful in helping with your own family history or local history research. We have a number of blog posts and podcasts and webinars. Podcasts and webinars are the distinction between the two is fairly hazy. The main one is that the webinars are usually accompanied by slides and that are integrated into them. The podcasts are usually recordings of live talks, but they often do have the slides with them as well. So the actual difference is quite small. And these are, growing in number. We have a blog post. There's usually about I think two, maybe three a week. It varies a little bit. So there's a huge library of blog posts, some of them on sort of topical anniversary subjects. The current one, as you can see there, is about the film Peterloo, which I think was released yesterday. And this is very concerned with a lot of records that are events that are recorded in records that we have here. So it's quite nice having a look at the webinars and the podcasts. And modesty forbids me from pointing out the listed webinar on there about missing from the census. And further down, we've got some very useful tutorials there about reading old documents, which is a combination of interpreting the often very difficult handwriting and also the Latin that some of the older documents are in. So we have useful resources there. And for people who are new to research and new to the National Archives, we have a virtual start here area. And further down, we've got advice on correct citation of documents. So there is a lot of content there about the archives and about how you can use them, and backup resources like the tutorials and the currency converter and the guide to using Roman numerals. So that's just the landing page for the help with your research. And as we go back up, you then go to a research guide that you're interested in. So that, oops, I didn't mean to go to that one, but that just shows you another set of guides, military and maritime guides. They're not specifically family history, although a lot of them will be of relevance to family historians. And as you can see, there's 139 in that category. So that's what I wanted to tell people about using the website as opposed to Discovery, the catalogue, which I will go into in depth a little bit later on. One of the important sets of records, which are really not that well known, is the records for Ireland and for Scotland. We're the National Archives of the UK, and in a lot of cases we're the National Archives for England and Wales, partly because so many records relate to England and Wales. The legal system of England and Wales is quite separate from the legal system for Scotland and for Ireland. So we don't have legal records on the whole from those two countries. But what we do have are records that are UK-wide. And these are military records, is one of the biggest collections. If anybody belonged to one of the armed services or the Merchant Navy or some other services like people who worked in naval dockyards or Customs and Excise or Coast Guard, those are all Britain-wide services, and you couldn't unpick the Irish bits from the Scottish bits from the English bits even if you wanted to. So those are UK-wide records. And historically, the Army and the Navy, the Army in particular, have always had a very high proportion of Irish-born people in them. It's easy to forget just how big Ireland used to be. It's the one bit of the British Isles where the population has declined dramatically since about 1850, or specifically from the famine years in the 1840s. The Irish population has gone down a lot, whereas the rest of the what was then all part of the UK has gone up quite a lot. So the Irish diaspora, of course, is by dint of all the emigration, is absolutely enormous. So huge numbers of people have Irish ancestors and often don't realise that those Irish ancestors, for the purposes of record keeping, and whether they liked it or not, they were British. So people researching Irish ancestors very often don't think of looking here at the archives in England, but this is absolutely where you should look. And a lot of these records, they apply equally to Scotland and Ireland. But we do have some records that are very specifically to do with Ireland in particular. We don't have any record sets that are very specifically about Scotland, because Scottish matters are either part of a UK-wide set, like Coast Guard records, Coast Guard stations all over the country. They're all just listed by county. There isn't a separate section of Scottish records as opposed to English ones. But we do have one particular guide, and there is a link to that in the handout, and that's the records of the Jacobite rebellions, 1715 and 1745. The reason we have a lot of those records is because of the retribution after the failure of those rebellions. It's really about the punishment of the losers, the people deemed to be the offenders and the rebels. And an awful lot of those records are actually in treasury classes. Everything can end up in treasury. It's all about money. And those records, if you do have a potential Jacobite ancestor, these can be very helpful, because much like Wales, the Highlands of Scotland have a relatively small pool of both Christian names and surnames. So you will often find many, many people of the same name. And some of the information in these Jacobite records can be very helpful for tying people to particular places. But that's really the only one that's very specifically Scottish. For Ireland, there is a very great deal more. We've got a couple of record sets which are very specifically Irish, and a couple of them are online. The records of the Royal Irish Constabulary are very, very good, very detailed, and they've fairly recently gone online within the last year or two. And also a thing which is correctly called the Irish Reproductive Loan Fund. Those are also digitized. They're also on Find My Past, who describe them as poverty relief loans, 1821 to 1874. They're only for part of Ireland. They're not for all the provinces, but they are extremely useful because they go right down to very, very local village level, and they have the names of lots of very ordinary people, the ones who don't even appear in the Irish land records because they don't even hold a patch of land. So those are extremely useful records. The Irish population in the 19th century was extremely closely watched, and we have lots and lots of records of them being observed. We have records here, and National Archives in Ireland have some, but the Irish collection that we have is absolutely enormous. I did record a podcast about that a number of years ago, and it will be updated. It's on the list of things to be re-recorded because it really needs updating. So feel free to go and find that, but do bear in mind it's quite out of date because a lot has gone online since then. Now, the other next big topic I wanted to do is looking at Discovery itself, the catalogue. Now, when you're on this homepage, there is a very obvious link called Search the Catalogue. Before I go to that, though, I just want to show you something very interesting, which a lot of people miss, and it's this menu button. It's right there. It's bright red, and it's in the middle of the top of the screen, but it's amazing how many people miss it. This is a very useful way of navigating quickly to other bits of the website. In this case, I don't need it to go to search the catalogue because there is a button on this page. But if I was on any other page where I could see this menu, if you click on it, it's like pulling down a roller blind, and there you will see quick links to all sorts of other bits of the website. I find it most useful when you've already visited somewhere and you have a rough idea where you're going, but you can't quite remember the convoluted path you took to get there. So you see there are links directly to Discovery and to that help with your research page, and a number of other things. So I just thought I'd show you that. It's worth remembering. Anyway, to Discovery. One of the important things to remember about Discovery and the National Archives is that although it can look very similar to sites that a lot of family historians have been using, like Family Search, Find My Past, Ancestry, that it's got a search page and you can do a search and it will search everything everywhere. And there's an advanced search option, which I wish were more prominent, but it is there. And you can put in a name and sometimes find a digitized document that you can look at and download. It looks similar, but there's a really important difference, and that is that Discovery in the National Archives, it's not a family history site. A very high proportion of our users are family historians, and that's what keeps me in a job. But the National Archives and the website have a lot of other functions too. So it's important to know the strengths and the limitations. I've already mentioned that a lot of the records we have are digitized on other websites, but some of them are on Discovery. Now, to search Discovery, you see on the landing page, there's a link back to the research guides. And there are links to some of the popular collections. And this can be quite useful if you want, if you know that what you want to look at is one of these, like some of the Navy or Royal Marine Service records and so on. And it does take you, this one that says view more collections, that takes you to a good overview of online collections, and the wills will take you to a number of resources, including the PCC wills that I mentioned. But what I wanted to point out, and that a lot of people don't notice, is that if you go to the advanced search, this opens up a whole lot of different options for you. If you're a really good operator and you know about the Boolean search terms, all the ands and brackets and nears and pluses, you can do very, very sophisticated searches just using that one search box. Most of us aren't like that. Personally, I like to see instructions that are in English, things that I can read and understand. And apart from that, even if you do know all those Boolean operators, the instructions here can tell you what the search engine will allow you to do, what kind of search parameters you can use. And this is, as you can see, all words. So that's the words that you put in there. It will seek for them in the same document. Doesn't matter what order they're in, but it will look for any catalogue description that has both or all of those words in it. If there's an exact word or phrase that you're looking for, then you can put that in the exact word or phrase box. That's fairly obvious. And sometimes if you're not sure what the right term will be, you might want to put in a couple of words that have a similar meaning, but in the hope that one of them will fetch up in a document description. It's useful for place searches sometimes if you don't know if a set of records is arranged by county or by town. If you put in Maidstone and Kent, and it will look for either of those. So that can be useful. The don't find can be useful when you've already done a number of searches and you keep getting the same irrelevant things coming up. That's a way of filtering them out. And you can limit your search to particular record series. The important thing to remember about Discovery is that it's got the catalogue descriptions, and the catalogue description is what people put on, some civil servant or some clerk, what they wrote on the spine of the book or on the cover of the box or something. It's the description that's on the thing that arrives here. And sometimes that's a very helpful description. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's something like incoming correspondence and a date range, which gives you no clue as to what the goodies might be that are in that. Going into Discovery in detail, I can help you find all sorts of ways of getting around that. My very favourite catalogue description, which is genuine, you can look it up if you want to. It's in the record series NDO, which is the National Debt Office. And the description is something like bundle of sundry loose documents, more or less interesting. And I looked at them and on balance, I'd say less interesting, but what do I know? There are a lot of functions in Discovery, far too many to go into now. But if you look down at the bottom, yes, you can select a date range. But if you only want to search for records within the National Archives, you can use the radio button here, and that opens up lots of other oops, lost my screen. Right. It will open up lots of other options for you. You can also elect to search other archives, which I would cover in a later session. If you open up search only the National Archives, you've got lots more filters and functions that you can use. You probably won't need to use most of them, but they are there and they can be very useful. Some of the records in Discovery have been the subject of enhanced cataloguing, and there are some things that you can search by name and download, but there are far more that you can't. That's not enough of Discovery, but I could spend hours on this, but you really don't want me to. The next set of records I wanted to talk about would be Armed Forces records, which I've already alluded to, that they are very, very useful for people of Irish as well as British descent, because there are so many people in the armed forces, and the Admiralty and the War Office. And later on the Air Ministry, were very, very good at record keeping. And the good news is that a lot of these records have been indexed or digitized. The bad news is that sometimes there are missing records. A lot of records for soldiers in the First World War, unfortunately, were destroyed by bombing. But that still leaves a huge number of records to explore. And I will go into some detail about how you can use those. Again, some of them are on our own website and some of them are on what we call partner websites. And that leads me on to the whole business of online records. The reason that we have so many records online is that, unlike American archives, and as far as I know, Canadian ones as well, all the images of the records, they are all Crown copyright, which means that nobody can use them without our permission, we as the National Archives. That means that we can generate an income from them. And so a lot of these records are licensed. Very often a commercial company will approach us and say, we're very interested in these records. Can we buy a license to digitize and index them? And we have a whole licensing department that deals with that. When it's a really big set of records, like the big collections of military records or census records, then those are sort of special categories that where we have official partners. They're called licensed internet associateships, which is a terrible name. And those are the ones, if you go on to usually Ancestry or Find My Past, or in some cases the genealogist, sometimes you'll see a set of records where they've got our big capital A logo on there, and that means that they are the official partner, and they get they pay more for those, but they also get the benefit of a bit more sort of co-branding, and we help with the publicity and the launches of these big things. But none of these records is exclusive. Sometimes a new record, I mean, the most recent one would be the 1939 register, which was only on Find My Past for a couple of years. That's what's called a primacy period. But no record is exclusive to any site in perpetuity. Once the sort of primacy period is up, other sites can buy a license if they want to. So that means that we can generate an income from that, which means that we can put that into running some of the other services. And the upfront costs of launching a huge series like a census, they simply could not be done with government money, because we are a government department and the Treasury doesn't really think speculating to accumulate is a great way to go. So that's how I explain a bit about the online records and how you can work out which records are online and which aren't. If you, excuse me, if you go into the main page of Discovery, you'll see that there is this View More Collections. This is a list of online collections, and it doesn't list absolutely everything, but you can see it lists in alphabetical order some of the main collections that have been digitized. And on the right hand side, it will tell you if these records have been digitized on another site. So sometimes you will see a Find My Past or an Ancestry logo, and in some cases, and I'm not going to scroll down to it because it's a long down. Passenger lists, we have got some on Ancestry and some on Find My Past. So you'll see both logos there. And we have non-conformist records, which are on the genealogist, but they are also on the other two big sites as well, much like the census. If there is no logo against it on the right, that means that those records are online on our website. So that gives you a rough idea, but there are all sorts of ways you can use Discovery to drill down in more detail and find out exactly what's online. And there is something which I did put a link to in the handout, which is rather good. And it's called this free online records digital microfilm. This is where we have microfilm, and it's not going to get the 5-star indexing treatment anytime soon. So, excuse my coughing again. Those have just been run through the big bad scanner, and they've turned microfilm rolls into great big PDFs, which you can download for free. Now, they're not indexed, but it means that you can download them and you can go through them image by image at 3 a.m. in your pajamas and bunny slippers if you want to, rather than going to somewhere that's got a microfilm reader and threading the microfilm and looking through it. So some of those can be very useful. And they're a little bit underused, but I think if it's free, it's always going to be worth looking at. Sort of related to that is finding aids and indexes to National Archives records. There are some which we have on our own site, and there are some which are on other sites. Obviously, things like Family Search and FreeSen have got lots of wonderful free indexes that you can use to locate records that are held by the National Archives. But there are all sorts of others. There's an organisation which actually belongs to the National Archives called the List and Index Society. And that produces volumes. There's about 357, I think, at the last count. And these are guides to National Archives records. Some of the very old ones are long out of print. Some of them are, the more recent ones are available for sale. They are mostly not name indexes, but they're still very useful for guiding you to specific record sets if you're doing local history. And if you're doing family history, you really should be doing a bit of local history too. And there's another very useful site, which is quite separate from us. It's called British History Online. And that's an online library of historical sources. And it has things like Victoria County histories, where I've often said to people, whether you're looking at the online or the print edition, never mind reading what it says. I'm sure that's excellent, but look at the footnotes, because they're very, very comprehensively cited. And if you know that somebody who's interested in the village that your ancestors came from, have a look at the Victoria County history entry for that and see what sources they used. And if they're National Archives sources, then maybe follow those up and see if there's something there that will be of interest to you. There are other books like British Record Society and Harlane Society. Some of these old books that were old indexes to things like probate records. Some of those old books, they are now appearing, because they're old and out of copyright, on things like Google Books, or better still, the Internet Archive. And those can be very valuable, especially for PCC administrations, which are not indexed anywhere else. We've got indexes in the search room, but there's no online index, and the records aren't digitized yet. So those can be extremely useful, and there are quite a few other examples. Sometimes you'll have to translate the notes into a National Archives reference, but there are ways of doing that. And finally, I finish with sort of moving away. I'll talk a bit about beyond England and Wales, and this is movement and migration, not just people migrating from the UK mainly to North America, but also to other places. We have got not as many resources as you'd hope. Passenger lists start very late, unfortunately, not until 1890. And before that, there are odd, scrappy bits of information. But your British Isles ancestors, they might not always have been British. There's always been a lot of toing and froing, particularly from Europe. So your British ancestors might have been German or French a couple of centuries before. So it can be useful looking at the records of people coming into the UK. Again, the records, I'm afraid, are very patchy, but that doesn't mean there aren't any at all. And we've got a couple of guides that will guide you to what little there might be. And bear in mind that it's immigration and emigration from the British Isles point of view. So immigrants are the people coming to us mainly from Europe, and the emigrants are the people going out the other side and getting on a ship to North America. But there's some very, very useful links in there. And some of the sources are not the obvious ones like passenger lists. There are very limited records of passports, and they are very disappointing. It's really not the way to go. But there are various other records that will help you make links between countries. And of course, a lot of British people, this being a former imperial power, moved around within the empire, particularly to India. Although we don't have those records, they're mostly at the British Library. But we do have other records of people moving around between the colonies and the old country. And finally, you can use Discovery, and I will go back to the Discovery homepage by this method. Search Discovery, our catalogue, slowly. If you go to the advanced search, yes, you can search the catalogues of other archives, which I briefly mentioned. But at the top, the default is to search the records. And believe it or not, records, that is a tab. I wish it looked a bit more like a tab, but we have another one, which is called Record Creators. And that is but the old National Register of Archives, which some people may have used. And this is how you find particular collections. So if you put in something like Churchill, and then hit search or enter, that will give you ridiculous number of results. It will tell you where you can find records of Churchill Parish and Churchill Charities. And if you go down, you will find links to records to do with the Churchill family. If you narrow it down a bit and put in Winston. If I could spell, I'd be dangerous. Instead, if you put Winston Churchill instead, you get a more sensible number. But it tells you where you can find records relating to Sir Winston Churchill, and where you can find them. It says, so many collections held by so many archives. And if you follow those links, it will tell you where those collections are held. And some of them are in quite surprising places for people, figures like Churchill. Some of the collections are actually held overseas, particularly in America. So that can lead you down some very interesting routes. And that really is just a skip across the stepping stones of some of the resources that we have. There's so much more than I haven't even been able to touch on. So I hope some of you at least will be enthused enough to spend a week with me in Salt Lake City in October. And for those of you who can't, I hope that you will at least have got something out of this session, and also out of the handouts. And there are some links in there for things that you can go and explore by yourself. But I do hope that that I will see at least some of you in just under a year's time. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you. That was fabulous. It's true. You can really go on and on and on. There's just so much in here.
You know me so well. Yeah.
No. Too funny.
No, I know what you meant. But...
Too funny.
Gotcha.
You did so. Anyway, while you were talking, I actually looked up the difference between podcast and webinar because I didn't know. And the difference is that podcasts are pre-recorded. That's the only difference.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yes, I mean, I mean, in our case, we started. They evolved really. We started doing podcasts because we were doing lectures on site, and then we found that we had the relatively primitive technology, but at least we had the technology to record them. And then they were going out in sound only. And then we found in some cases we could add the slides. We couldn't always, because sometimes they were subject to copyright, that it was okay to show them in a room, but you couldn't broadcast them on the internet. And then we had more technology, like we don't use GoToMeeting, but we've used a number of others where we could do a webinar where the slides were integrated, although we kind of spoiled the definition because sometimes the webinars are pre-recorded for some sort of for
Right.
various technical reasons. So,
Yeah,
so there are distinctions, but it is quite blurred. And
quite blurred.
for most people, for the audience, it probably doesn't matter. It's a bit like
No.
which TV channel is it on, who cares?
Yeah,
But there
exactly,
is some
exactly.
very
But I think the National Archives and Family Search are two resources that people don't realize how much educational information is
mm.
on them, right?
Oh yes, very much
Just
so.
a
Yes,
ton of
right.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we have somebody here who had actually asked a question, but then you answered it. So I'll just give you the information from it. She has plans to be in Dublin for a month next spring and is now, after this, planning to also come over to London to do some
Oh, good.
military record research.
Mm.
So,
Right. Yes, although most of the records for the individual records, a lot of those are online, but there is still a lot that isn't. So although you can always start your military research online, but there are lots of things. I mean, muster rolls in particular are things that they're still relatively untouched. So it's always worth looking at the guides and do your homework in advance to see what there is that you can only do here, and then
mhm,
concentrate on that.
on that, yeah.
But
And
I'm
the
sure
other
we can
thing
find
is,
plenty for you to do.
you gave a perfect example that people don't understand. It's not just the country where your ancestors were. For you to have
Mm,
such a rich collection for Irish research,
mm.
most people wouldn't even
Oh, yes.
consider, right, using that. Yeah, yeah, it's
Well,
incredible.
exactly. My mission to inform and explain, because I'm so often I'll open a magazine and it will say, 10 top sites for doing Irish research, and we
And you're not in it.
almost
Yeah,
never feature, and we really should. And I
absolutely.
have my talk about Irish records. Said there is a fairly out of date version on the website, which I will be recording. But that's a talk which I have hawked around several American states, and also a few places in Britain as well. And I do a parallel one about Scotland, but a lot of it is substantially the same. But we do have some phenomenal Irish records. And
Hmm.
increasingly, that they are getting picked up and digitized. But there's still a tremendous amount. We've got a
Yeah.
box of passports, and some of them have
Oh,
photographs. Just one box, but
oh,
they're
oh my
terrific.
gosh! Now I want to get in a plane and come. Yeah, and it's the same. I mean, I
You're
tell
very
people I do.
welcome. Coffee's on me.
I do Scottish research and tell people, that they
Mm.
need to check the National Archives, particularly for the Jacobite and the military. I mean, that's where you're going to find it,
Yes,
right? Is there?
I mean, I found when I did the talk about Scottish records in the National Archives, I did at Roots Tech earlier this year. When I started delving into the Scottish records a bit more, I found that they're much less visible. There is a lot there, but we really don't have any very obvious Scottish collections. Most of it is sort of hiding in plain sight within a UK wide. I mean, I
Right.
found some, I think, like rentals and mineral rights, and other, but they tend to be part of a Britain-wide collection. Whereas at least some of the Irish records, they do scream Ireland at you because they are,
Specifically, yeah, yeah. Good. So we've had
they're called the Dublin Castle records or something like that. Or mm,
Yeah, much
carry on.
more obvious. So really, not a whole lot of questions. A couple of people have asked again about the handout, so I will be emailing that out to
Mm,
people later today, shortly actually. This webinar has
uh-huh.
been recorded, and unlike the ones that we've had so far, this one will continue to be freely available. It will be on the Society's YouTube channel and also on the website. The others that have been recorded, the recording is for members only, but because this is useful in terms of promoting the TNA course at British Institute, we're going to keep it public, so that people can see
Fantastic.
just how much
I'll
information there.
tell all my
I mean, this has
friends.
been this has been
Yeah,
an hour, and we've learned so much. Can you imagine a full week? It's incredible.
yeah, just
And
think of a whole week with me, folks. Yes.
they'll need drapes, Audrey. And then just tons of praise about how wonderful this has been. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, that's
Uh,
terrific.
yeah, and how much you've been able to get out of it. So
And
Audrey, thank
I
you so
always
much.
learn a lot. Can I just say, I always learn a lot whenever I'm doing a talk or a webinar. the speaker can learn as much as the audience sometimes, because it's really, really helpful to know the kind of questions that people are asking. Because
Right.
if we get the same question that you haven't already answered, you think, maybe I should put that in the next talk. Maybe I should put that in the guide. And that's what quite a lot of my job involves, not just imparting information, but listening to what the questions are and trying to anticipate them. So thank you all very much for listening, and for the people who asked questions.
Yes, wonderful. Actually, I've discovered too that sometimes you get the question often enough, it leads to a separate topic and talk.
Oh yeah, that too, yes.
All right. I will actually be teaching the Scottish course, so I'm looking forward to seeing you twice next year, once at Roots Tech and then again at British Institute. So I will see you then. Thanks
Oh,
again, Audrey.
fantastic. Yeah, and if you're coming over to the UK for anything, of course.
Oh, I know. I know. I'll
Yeah.
need to make a side trip now. All right. I'll talk to you
Yeah.
later. Bye.
Okay, terrific. Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.